Okay, today we're going to start out by taking a look at, or beginning to look at, Myers Chapter 2, which is Biology and the Brain. Basically, talking about neuroscience, the whole idea of how the brain and the body and environment and everything work together to affect behavior. This is, or tends to be, one of the more difficult chapters that students have trouble with a lot of times because I think, in part, a lot of times you don't understand exactly why we have to study the brain or why we have to study these various parts of the brain and what they do. And so a lot of times I think it's important for you to understand kind of how the interaction takes place. So that's the very first thing that we're going to look at here is how is it, that the brain actually impacts behavior, and why do we really even need to know this stuff? That's kind of an interesting deal. Remember, one of the major goals of psychology is to try to explain behavior, and to do that, we have to look at a variety of sources. Behavior can be impacted by genetics. It can be impacted by biology and or by the environment. So there's a variety of things that we're going to look at. So let's take a look, for example, at genetics and biology and how that can kind of play into behavior. For example, when you hear that something is genetic. Okay, if we said that the color of your eyes or your height or your weight or something of that nature is genetic, most people accept that and they say, yeah, we kind of knew that. No big deal. But when you mention something else, for example, alcoholism, a lot of times there's been a lot of research done lately on whether or not alcoholism may be genetic. Or we could look at depression or schizophrenia or Alzheimer's and try and determine if any of those things are genetic. What we really mean by that, okay, for example, with alcoholism, when we say something, that something's genetic, technically what we're saying is that the genes or the DNA that that individual has makes it more likely for someone to obtain that particular disorder or that type of behavior, whatever it is. So, for example, alcoholism. There's been a lot of studies done lately in the last, I don't know how many years now, trying to determine if alcoholism is genetic. Most of the studies tend to point to a genetic connection, but we have not, at least at this point in time, I don't think they've found directly what particular gene or genes combination are related to alcoholism, although they do believe that there is a connection. But technically, again, when we say that like a gene, like alcoholism is a genetic disorder or a genetic situation, technically what that means is that there would be a gene or some gene combination that would produce, for example, a protein that, given certain circumstances, would increase the probability of alcoholism. Just because something's genetic does not guarantee that that behavior is going to actually occur. Now, with that in mind, okay, we know that genetics kind of affects biology, and then we're also trying to look in this chapter at how biology impacts behavior. Let's take a look at something like addiction. Okay, we're talking about alcoholism. It could be drug addiction, gambling addiction. People are addicted to a variety of things. And basically, we'd have to ask a question, why are people addicted to certain things? Well, it's because it tends to bring them more pleasure than anything else. And so, for whatever reason, I had an older brother who was an alcoholic. He He would block out everything else because he wanted to drink. Alcohol brought him a particular pleasure that nothing else seemed to be able to do. So that's what happens a lot of times with addiction, is whether it's the alcohol, whether it's the drugs, or some type of behavior such as gambling or even sexual activities, those kinds of addictions can basically, it's a reward situation that occurs in the brain. And if we take a look, there's been a lot of research recently on the brain, and they have found that a little area of the brain, and I'm going to see if we can point to it right down here. This little area of the brain that's red in this picture, okay, you may never have heard of it, but it's called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is this little bitty area of the brain there. It's not a huge area, but little area of the brain that is very, very rich in dopamine receptors. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. That's one of the neurotransmitters we're going to talk about. And basically, think of it as a chemical within the brain. And the nucleus accumbens has a lot of dopamine receptors in that area. So essentially, the more dopamine that's produced in that particular area, the more the brain becomes active. And it ends up that tends to be a pleasure center of the brain. It's kind of like a reinforcement center for the brain. And it doesn't matter, if it's like alcoholism or if it's drugs, some other drug. It could be gambling, could be video games, could be a variety of things that causes those dopamine receptors to light up, and essentially the nucleus accumbens becomes very active in the brain when those addictions are taking place. Now, what's interesting is that in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, they have found that the brain can literally kind of rewire itself. Or, in other words, it can reorganize. It can create different neurons and neural pathways. We're going to call them neural networks. They can literally change or become reorganized within, like, the nucleus accumbens. And let's take for example, okay, let's say cocaine. There's been research showing that repeated use of cocaine increases the brain's ability to release dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, that area of the brain. So not only does more dopamine go into that area of the brain, but also the person's tendency to seek that particular drug increases, because it's a reward for them. It's something that brings them great pleasure. Now, what tends to happen is with repeated use. Okay, let's say that the person continues to use cocaine over and over and over. What ends up happening is that the nucleus accumbens will react and respond to cocaine, but it will be less likely to respond to other things that tended to be incentives in the past. So normal incentives, like a person playing video games or gambling or even sexual behavior, those things become less important to the person and less rewarding to the person because the nucleus accumbens becomes rewired. So basically what happens is whatever the addiction is, let's say that the person's addicted to cocaine, well then cocaine becomes one of the only things that can really bring pleasure for that person. Everything else becomes kind of filtered out. So hopefully this kind of makes a little bit of sense. You've got genetic influences that cause certain people to be more susceptible than others when it comes to some of these types of things, such as addiction or alcoholism, things like that. And then you have For example, the biological component where the brain reacts in certain ways, and the brain can actually even change its reaction depending on how much or how little of a particular behavior that occurs. And then the environment also has to come into play. For example, just because someone is born with maybe a genetic predisposition to alcoholism does not guarantee that they're going to become an alcoholic. If they don't drink, or if they, are very careful in watching how much they drink and so forth, it's very possible that they might not become an alcoholic. The tendency would be there, but it doesn't guarantee it. So when you think of the combination, you could kind of think of it as sort of like genes and biology kind of getting a gun loaded and ready to fire, but it's the environment that actually pulls the trigger and determines if that person does exhibit that particular trait. Key concept to remember when we're talking about this unit, and everything through chapter 2, when we're talking about this, just remember this: any change in the brain structure, in other words, the composition of the brain, any change, microscopic change in the structure of the brain, or if there's any change in the chemistry, or in other words, the neurotransmitters that are in the brain, any kind of change in either one of those is going to result in a change in behavior. A person's behavior will change dependent upon those things. There's so much research now that they have essentially linked virtually all of the mental illnesses to some type of a biological component in the brain that basically means that some people are kind of predisposed toward certain mental illnesses while others may not be. But it's all kind of a combination of heredity mixing in with the environment. Okay? I think that's all for this one.